I overheard her telling her friends, "I'm so tired of my pathetic sister thinking we're close." Can you even imagine walking into your own sister's birthday party, a custom cake in your hands that you spent 3 days perfecting, only to hear her call you pathetic to her closest friends? That moment, that exact split second, everything I thought I knew about my family, about my sister, just shattered. What the hell happened next, you ask? Well, let me tell you. I'd used my key to let myself in early that day, thinking I was doing a favor. Victoria had asked me to come help decorate for her 25th, you know? But apparently, the pre-party gossip session had already started. "I'm so sick of my pathetic sister thinking we're close," I heard her say, her voice dripping with disdain. Then, those words cut right through me. "What did you just say?" My sister, Victoria, and her 6 best friends whipped around. Their faces went from laughing to absolute panic. I was standing there, frozen in the doorway, still holding that cake. "Oh my God, you're here already," Victoria sputtered, her face now a mask of horror. But her friend, Chloe, she was still giggling, still riding the high of the gossip. "Tell her what you just said about the Christmas thing," she prodded, practically bouncing. Victoria shook her head, a frantic, silent plea for Chloe to stop, but it was too late. Chloe blurted it out. "She was just telling us how you bought her that expensive necklace, thinking it meant something. The Tiffany necklace you cried over when she gave you a gift card." The air left my lungs. They all started laughing again, a chorus of cruel cackles echoing in the apartment. I felt like a fool. A complete, utter fool. With trembling hands, I gently placed the cake on the counter, making sure not to damage the delicate fondant roses I'd sculpted by hand. "You asked me to come early to help," I managed, my voice barely a whisper. Victoria just rolled her eyes, already pouring herself more wine. "I asked you to drop off the cake. Don't hang around trying to insert yourself." Her friend Becca nodded, chiming in. "She's always complaining about how you try to act like your best friends." Always complaining. My own sister. The one who called me every single night to vent about her job, her boss, her life. My heart hammered against my ribs. "But you call me every day," I blurted out, a desperate plea for her to see the hypocrisy. Victoria just laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. "Because you're free therapy, obviously. Real therapists cost money." She turned back to her friends, a smug smirk on her face. "She actually thinks I value her advice about my love life." They all erupted in laughter again. Chloe piled on. "Remember when she offered to do your makeup for Brad's wedding?" Victoria groaned dramatically. "She watched 2 YouTube videos and thought she was qualified." I felt a hot flush creep up my neck. "You said my work was beautiful," I whispered, utterly bewildered. Victoria sipped her wine, completely unbothered. "What was I supposed to say? You looked so proud of your little hobby." Her friend Janet, who always had to add her 2 cents, piped up. "Is this the sister who made that weird scrapbook for your graduation?" Victoria nodded, reaching under the coffee table. My breath hitched. It was the scrapbook. The one I'd spent 3 months creating, filled with photos from our entire childhood, each page a testament to our bond. "Look at this pathetic thing," she scoffed, flipping it open to a page where I'd written about how proud I was of her. Listen to this caption. "My amazing sister inspires me every day." The room exploded with laughter once more. That's when it hit me. The real dagger. "I felt bad for you," Victoria said, her voice devoid of any warmth. "You don't have any real friends, so I pretend we're close." She gestured to her friends. "These are my real sisters. You're just someone I happen to share DNA with." Janet, ever the enabler, poured more wine for everyone but pointedly ignored me. "Tell her about the wedding thing," she practically shrieked. Victoria's eyes lit up with this cruel excitement. "So, I'm getting engaged soon." This was news to me. Shocking news. Brad's proposing next month. I already know because I helped pick the ring. She looked at me, a mean smile playing on her lips. "And you're not going to be my maid of honor." Her friends all smiled, knowing exactly how much that would hurt. "Chloe's my maid of honor. Becca, Janet, and my college roommate are bridesmaids." She paused, letting it sink in. You're not even invited to the bachelorette party. My stomach dropped. I'd been planning her future bachelorette party in my head for years. But I'm your sister, I choked out. Victoria stood up and walked over to me, her presence looming.
Exactly.
You're my sister, not my friend. There's a difference. She picked up the cake, my cake, and examined it with disdain. Like this cake. It's trying too hard. Professional bakers exist for a reason. And then, in slow motion, she ran her finger through the frosting, ruining the design I'd spent hours on. But you always insist on making everything about you. Becca chimed in. Remember when she threw you that surprise party you specifically said you didn't want? I had thrown her that party because she'd complained about feeling forgotten on her birthday. You said you loved it. You cried happy tears. Victoria laughed, a brittle, harsh sound. I cried because I was embarrassed. You invited all those random people from my high school I haven't talked to in years. She turned to her friends, rolling her eyes. She actually thought I'd want to see them.
Just then, the doorbell rang.
More guests, the real partygoers, started arriving. Victoria grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly tight. You can leave the cake and go. I looked around the room, at the decorations I'd bought and spent hours setting up yesterday. The streamers, the banners, the balloons. I decorated this whole place, I whispered, my voice thick with disbelief. Victoria shrugged, completely uncaring. And it looks like a kid's party. We're redoing it anyway. Her friends, like a pack of hyenas, started pulling down the streamers I'd carefully arranged. You know what the worst part is? Victoria said, loud enough for the arriving guests to hear. She actually thinks we have some special bond because our parents died. Our parents. Gone for 3 years. We'd promised to always be there for each other. I felt a cold knot in my stomach. That trauma bonding stuff is fake. I have real friends for emotional support. Just then, the most incredible, unexpected thing happened. Our Aunt Helen walked in for the party. What's going on here? She asked, her gaze sweeping over my tear-streaked face and the ruined cake. Victoria, ever the manipulator, immediately changed her tone. Oh, Aunt Helen. My sister was just dropping off the cake. She can't stay, though. But Janet, who had clearly been drinking too much, blurted out. Victoria was just explaining how she's sick of pretending to like her sister. Aunt Helen's face went dark. I mean, dark. Pretending, she said, her voice deceptively quiet. She looked at Victoria. Your sister, who pays half your rent because you can't afford it on your own. The entire room went silent. Victoria's face flushed a furious red. Aunt Helen stepped between Victoria and me, her voice cutting through the suddenly hushed party noise, loud enough that new guests stopped in the doorway, staring, watching. Victoria's face went from red to ashen white in seconds. More people kept arriving, crowding into the entrance, and they all heard every single word. Victoria tried to laugh, a brittle, fake sound, like this was some kind of joke, but it failed miserably. Aunt Helen wasn't done talking, and everyone in that apartment knew it. She looked at Victoria with an expression I'd never seen before, like she was looking at a complete stranger instead of her niece. The room was utterly silent. Someone's phone buzzed, a jarring sound in the stillness. Victoria's friends exchanged uncomfortable glances. Chloe and Bianca looked like they were trying to decide whether to run or just melt into the floor. Victoria opened her mouth, but nothing came out. I grabbed my purse from where I'd left it by the door, my hand shaking. I started gathering up the decorations. The streamers and banners I'd paid for that were already half pulled down. Aunt Helen followed me into the hallway, placing a firm hand on my shoulder. Victoria just stood frozen in her living room doorway, the ruined cake sitting on the counter behind her, fondant roses smashed. Aunt Helen's voice was quieter now, but still resolute. She told me to come stay with her tonight, that we needed to talk. I just nodded. I couldn't trust my voice to work. As we walked to the elevator, I could hear Victoria starting to speak to her friends, her voice getting louder, more defensive. The elevator doors closed before I could hear what excuse she was making this time. At Aunt Helen's house, That's when I finally broke down. The kind of crying where you can't catch your breath, where your whole body shakes uncontrollably. She made tea in her kitchen while I sat on her couch, trying to stop the tears, failing completely. The mug was warm in my hands when she brought it over, sitting next to me, just listening. I told her everything. About how Victoria called me every single night to complain about her job, her coworkers, her problems with Brad. Everything. How I truly believed we were close, that those calls meant something, that I was helping her. How I'd been paying half her rent for 2 years because she claimed her job didn't pay enough. Aunt Helen just listened, no interruptions, just quiet nods or small sounds that showed she was hearing me. I told her about the necklace, the scrapbook, all the things I'd made or bought, thinking they mattered to Victoria. My voice kept breaking, but I couldn't stop. Once I started, it was like a dam had burst. Then, Aunt Helen pulled out her phone. She scrolled for a moment, then showed me texts from Victoria, stretching back over the past year. Messages asking for money, talking about expensive dinners she was going to with Brad, planning weekend trips. The words on that screen made my stomach hurt worse than it already did. Aunt Helen told me Victoria had been using me, plain and simple. That this wasn't what sisters did. And hearing someone else say it out loud, give it a name, made it feel so much more real. I slept in Aunt Helen's guest room that night, but slept is a strong word. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, replaying every single conversation with Victoria in my head. All those late-night calls where she'd complained about everything suddenly felt different. Like I was just a convenient person she could dump her problems on, without caring about my feelings or my time. Every piece of advice I'd ever given her about Brad, about her job, about her life, and she'd been laughing about it with her friends, calling me pathetic, saying I had no real friends. My mind latched onto specific moments, specific things she'd said that I'd taken as signs of our closeness. And now they all looked twisted. The ceiling fan went around and around, a hypnotic blur, until the sky outside started getting lighter. The next morning, I called in sick to work. I just couldn't face pretending everything was normal. My boss answered, and I told her I had a family emergency, which, honestly, wasn't even a lie. Aunt Helen made breakfast, and we sat at her kitchen table, making a practical plan. A plan for how I could separate myself from Victoria financially. She had a notepad, writing things down as we talked. First step, stopping the automatic rent transfer. Second, closing the shared household account. Third, getting my name off any joint bills. The list just kept growing, and I felt sick looking at how tangled up our lives had become. I checked my bank account on my phone. The rent payment was due in 5 days. I'd been automatically transferring my half, plus Victoria's half, every month, like clockwork, because she said her job didn't pay enough. Now, I was wondering if that was even true, or just another lie. The numbers on my screen, showing how much money I'd sent her month after month, made me want to throw my phone across the room. Aunt Helen, ever practical, suggested I look at Victoria's social media to see what she'd actually been spending money on. I felt sick doing it, like I was betraying her, but I opened the apps anyway. Posts about expensive brunches with her friends. New designer bags she'd bought. Weekend trips with Brad to places I couldn't afford to even dream about. Photos of her, wearing clothes that cost more than my rent. Pictures of fancy restaurants, cocktails, shopping bags. All of it posted while I'd been eating ramen and peanut butter sandwiches to make sure I could send her that rent money. The dates on the posts lined up perfectly with times she'd told me she was struggling, that she needed my help. I scrolled back through months of posts, and with every single one, I felt more stupid for believing her. My phone started buzzing with calls from Victoria. I let them all go to voicemail. When I finally checked, there were 17 missed calls and dozens of texts. The first few were, "Sorry, didn't mean it, let's talk." Then they got angry. She said I was being dramatic, that Aunt Helen didn't understand our relationship, that everyone vents to their friends and I was making a big deal out of nothing. The texts kept coming, appearing on my screen one after another, and I just watched them. She said her friends were drunk and encouraged her. She said I always overreacted to everything. She said I needed to stop being so sensitive and just come home so we could talk about this like adults. I turned my phone face down on the table and left it there. I waited until Tuesday morning, knowing Victoria would be at her office downtown. The apartment key felt heavy in my hand as I unlocked the door and stepped inside. Everything looked the same, but it felt completely different now. The couch we'd picked out together last year, with the throw pillows I'd sewn by hand. The bookshelf holding books we'd both read and discussed over wine on Friday nights. Except now, I knew those conversations were probably just Victoria killing time while waiting for her real friends to be available. My stomach twisted looking at the framed photos on the wall. Pictures of us at the beach last summer, laughing so hard we couldn't breathe. I'd thought those moments meant something. I grabbed my suitcase from the closet and started throwing clothes inside, not even bothering to fold them. My hands moved fast, pulling shirts, pants, underwear from drawers, shoving shoes into bags. I needed to get out before Victoria came home early, or before I started crying again. The important documents were in the filing cabinet we shared, organized alphabetically because Victoria insisted on a system. My birth certificate, social security card, passport, all the paperwork from when our parents died. I took everything with my name on it and left the rest. In the bathroom, I grabbed my toothbrush and the expensive face cream Aunt Helen had given me for Christmas. Victoria's makeup covered most of the counter, all those products she bought while I was sending her rent money. The anger felt good then, better than the hurt. There was a note on the kitchen counter, written on the back of a takeout receipt in Victoria's perfect handwriting. Slightly crumpled, like she'd written it fast, or maybe even thrown it down. I picked it up. The words on it somehow made everything worse and clearer, all at once. Not sorry. Not an acknowledgement of what she'd said. Just concern about money, calling me childish for having feelings about being publicly humiliated. I folded the note and put it in my pocket. As evidence. Proof that I wasn't crazy for feeling used. This was who Victoria actually was when nobody was performing for her or giving her what she wanted. The apartment suddenly felt smaller, the walls closing in. I grabbed my bags and walked out without looking back, leaving my key on the counter next to where her note had been. Work the next day felt impossible. I sat at my desk, staring at my computer screen, the words blurring together. My coworker Lina kept glancing over at me between phone calls. We'd worked together for 2 years, but mostly just talked about projects and deadlines. Nothing personal. At lunch, she walked over to my desk with 2 sandwiches from the deli downstairs. She set one in front of me without asking and pulled up a chair. I tried to smile, to pretend everything was fine, but my face wouldn't cooperate. She waited patiently until I finally told her a short version of what happened. Just the basics. Victoria saying cruel things, Aunt Helen revealing the rent situation. Lina listened without interrupting. And when I finished, she didn't offer empty comfort or tell me it would be okay. She just said her roommate had moved out last week and the spare room was available if I needed a place to stay. No pity in her voice, no making it weird, just a practical solution. Offered like it was nothing. I almost started crying right there in the office, but managed to hold it together until I could hide in the bathroom. After work, I met Lina at her apartment across town. It was an older building than mine, or Victoria's, but well-maintained, with character instead of generic modern fixtures. She showed me the empty room. It was smaller than what I had now, but the rent was cheaper, and the space felt clean and simple. No memories attached to the walls. No furniture I'd bought thinking I was building a home with my sister. Lina explained the house rules in a straightforward way. Nothing complicated, just basic respect for shared space. She mentioned her schedule, when she was usually home, how she liked things quiet after 10 on weeknights. Everything felt balanced and fair. Like she saw me as an equal, instead of someone to manage or use. I told her I'd take it. We shook hands like adults making a business arrangement. She handed me a spare key and said I could move in whenever I was ready. The key felt lighter than the one I'd left at Victoria's place. That evening, I sat in Aunt Helen's guest room with my phone in my hands for 20 minutes before I finally opened my messages. My fingers typed out the text to Victoria, not letting myself overthink it or soften the words. Just the facts. I was moving out and I'd pay this month's rent, but nothing after. She could figure out how to afford the place on her own, or find someone new to use. I hit send before I could delete it and rewrite it nicer. The response came back so fast, she must have been staring at her phone. All caps. Calling me selfish and ungrateful. Saying I was abandoning her when she needed me most. More texts followed, each one angrier than the last, blaming me for ruining her life and being dramatic about nothing. I turned my phone face down and left it on the nightstand, my hands shaking. The banging on Aunt Helen's front door started at 9 p.m. Loud enough to hear from the guest room upstairs. Victoria's voice carried through the walls, high-pitched and crying, saying my name over and over. I stayed in bed, listening to Aunt Helen's footsteps going to the door, hearing her firm voice telling Victoria she couldn't come in. Through the floor, I could hear Victoria saying she didn't mean those things, that her friends were drunk and encouraged her, that I was abandoning her over a misunderstanding. The same excuses from her texts, but delivered with tears this time. Aunt Helen's voice stayed calm and steady, not letting Victoria twist the situation or make herself the victim. The conversation lasted maybe 10 minutes before I heard Victoria's car start and drive away. My chest felt tight the whole time, part of me wanting to run downstairs and fix things. The other part knowing that instinct was exactly the problem. Aunt Helen came back inside and found me sitting on the edge of the guest bed. She sat down next to me without asking if I was okay, because the answer was obvious. Her words cut through all my confused feelings and guilt, pointing out that Victoria wasn't taking responsibility, just upset about losing her free ride. The clarity helped, but I still felt guilty for feeling guilty, like I was betraying Victoria by seeing the truth. Aunt Helen put her hand on my shoulder and reminded me that real apologies don't come with excuses or blame. I nodded and tried to believe her, even though years of habit made me want to call Victoria back and smooth everything over. The weekend became a blur of boxes and bags and trips across town. Aunt Helen showed up Saturday morning with her car, and we loaded up my stuff from Victoria's apartment while she was out. We'd planned it that way, avoiding another confrontation or a chance for Victoria to guilt me into staying. Most of what I owned fit in Aunt Helen's trunk and back seat. Clothes, books, some kitchen supplies I'd bought with my own money. The furniture we'd split costs on stayed, because I didn't have the energy to fight about who paid what percentage or who deserved the couch more. Lina helped us carry everything up to her apartment. The three of us worked efficiently, without much talking. By Sunday afternoon, I was unpacked in my new room, clothes in the closet, books on the shelf. The space felt empty, but it was mine. No shared history or broken promises attached to anything in it. Monday morning, I went to the bank before work. The representative behind the desk had perfect professional politeness, asking for my ID and account numbers without any curiosity about why I was removing someone from my accounts. She printed forms and showed me where to sign, processing everything quickly. Victoria's name disappeared from the household account we'd set up 2 years ago, the one I'd been automatically transferring money into for rent and utilities. I closed that account completely and opened a new one with just my name. The paperwork took less than 30 minutes. And when I walked out the automatic doors, I felt lighter, like cutting a rope that had been pulling me underwater. My phone buzzed with a new text from Victoria, using a different number since I'd blocked her main one. The message said Brad's mother wanted to meet me to smooth things over before the engagement. Like this was all just a little disagreement that needed managing. The assumption that I'd participate in Victoria's life, help make her look good to her future in-laws, pretend everything was fine for her benefit. I blocked the new number. Then I went through my contacts and blocked Chloe, Bianca, and Janet too. Every number connected to that night at the party. Every person who'd laughed while Victoria tore me apart. My finger hovered over the delete button for a second before I pressed it, watching each name disappear from my phone. I was done being managed and manipulated. Done making myself smaller, so Victoria could feel bigger. The blocked list grew, and my chest felt less tight with each name I removed from my life. Lina left for her shift at the hospital around 6 a.m. most mornings. Her footsteps quiet in the hallway, trying not to wake me. I usually heard her anyway but stayed in bed, grateful for the consideration. She worked 12-hour shifts 3 days a week, which meant the apartment was mine on those long stretches when I got home from work. The other days she had off, I'd come back to find her cooking dinner or reading on the couch, and she'd ask if I wanted to join her, without any pressure if I said no. We fell into an easy rhythm where we existed in the same space without needing constant interaction. Some nights I'd sit at the kitchen table, working on my laptop, while she watched TV, and the quiet felt comfortable instead of awkward. When I needed to talk about Victoria or the party or how angry I still felt, Lina would put down whatever she was doing and just listen. She didn't offer advice unless I asked for it. Didn't try to fix anything. Just let me vent until I ran out of words. Having someone who gave me space but also showed up when I needed support felt completely different from what I'd had with Victoria. 2 weeks after moving out, my phone rang with an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. A woman's voice introduced herself as Thora Emery, the landlord for the apartment Victoria and I had shared. She sounded tired and a little annoyed when she asked if it was true I'd abandoned the lease without notice. My stomach dropped because I knew exactly what Victoria had told her. I explained that I'd given proper written notice, paid my portion of rent through the end of the month, and left a forwarding address for any deposit return. Thora went quiet for a second before asking why Victoria claimed I'd just disappeared and stuck her with the full rent. I took a breath and told her the truth. That Victoria had been financially capable of paying the full amount all along. That I'd been covering half because she said she couldn't afford it. But that was a lie. Thora made it sound like she was writing something down, and then mentioned she'd noticed Victoria driving a new car in the parking garage last week. A BMW, she said, and she'd wondered how someone who claimed money was tight could afford a luxury vehicle. The confirmation hit me like a punch. Victoria had been lying about her finances this entire time, taking my money while buying herself expensive things. And I'd been too trusting to question it. My hands shook as I thanked Thora for calling and hung up. The anger that rushed through me felt hot and sharp, different from the hurt I'd been carrying. Victoria hadn't just been cruel at the party. She'd been actively stealing from me for months, maybe years. Aunt Helen called that evening and mentioned she'd given me the number for a therapist named Isadora Mann. She said Isadora specialized in family trauma and had helped several people she knew work through difficult relationships. I made the appointment for the following week, partly because Aunt Helen suggested it, and partly because I was tired of feeling this angry all the time. The office was in a small building downtown with pale blue walls and plants in every corner. Isadora was maybe 50, with gray hair pulled back and kind eyes that didn't look away when I started talking. I told her about the party, about hearing Victoria call me pathetic, about the cake and the scrapbook and all the ways she'd mocked everything I'd done for her. Halfway through describing how our friends laughed, I started crying so hard I couldn't speak. Isadora handed me tissues and waited until I could breathe again before saying something that changed how I saw everything. She told me Victoria's behavior wasn't just mean or thoughtless. It was emotionally abusive. And it had probably been happening for years, in ways I'd normalized because she was my sister. The word abuse made me flinch at first because I associated that with physical violence. But Isadora explained emotional abuse was just as damaging. Using someone for money while making them feel worthless. Calling them every day but only to vent and never to listen. Mocking their efforts to show love. Those were all forms of abuse. I sat there in her office feeling like someone had finally put words to something I'd been experiencing but couldn't name. In our second session, Isadora asked me to make 2 lists. One for times I felt valued by Victoria, and one for times I felt used. I thought the exercise would be quick, but the used list kept growing. Every night she called to complain about work, but hung up when I tried to share my own problems. The time she borrowed my car for a weekend and returned it with an empty gas tank and new scratches. When she forgot my birthday, but expected me to plan elaborate celebrations for hers. The Christmas, she gave me a $20 gift card after I'd spent hundreds on her presents. The list filled 1 page, then 2, my handwriting getting messier as memories surfaced. The valued list had 3 items. She'd brought me soup when I had the flu 2 years ago. She'd helped me move into my first apartment 3 years back. She'd called me after our parents' funeral and said we only had each other now. All three things happened before our parents died, or right after. Nothing recent made the list. I stared at the pages feeling sick, because the evidence was right there, in black and white. Victoria had stopped valuing me years ago, but I kept trying to earn her love anyway. Isadora helped me see that Victoria had changed after the funeral. Before our parents died, she'd been self-centered, but not cruel. After, she became demanding and cold, taking everything I offered without giving anything back. I'd thought we were supporting each other through grief, both of us leaning on our sibling bond to survive the loss. But really, I was supporting her while she used me as a place to dump all her pain and frustration. She processed her grief by making me smaller, by taking out her anger on someone who wouldn't fight back. I became her emotional trash can, somewhere she could throw all her negative feelings without consequences. The realization made me so angry I had to leave the session early, walking around the block 3 times before I could get in my car. All those nights I'd stayed up listening to her cry about missing our parents, offering comfort and reassurance, and she'd been using me the whole time. She never asked how I was grieving, never noticed I was struggling too. Just took until there was nothing left of our relationship except her needs and my attempts to meet them. At work, I threw myself into a big project my boss had assigned. Something about reorganizing our client database that I'd been putting off for weeks. Without Victoria calling me every night, I had energy left at the end of the day. I stayed late a few evenings, working through spreadsheets and data entry that required a focus I hadn't been able to muster before. My boss stopped by my desk one afternoon and commented on my improved performance. Said she'd noticed I seemed more engaged lately. The compliment felt good, in a way Victoria's rare praise never had, because it was based on actual observation instead of manipulation. I realized how much mental space Victoria's nightly calls had taken up. How exhausted I'd been trying to solve her problems while neglecting my own work and life. Now that space was mine again, and I could use it for things that actually mattered to me. Aunt Helen invited me to Sunday dinner and mentioned on the phone that she'd told other family members what happened at the party. My stomach twisted with anxiety because I didn't know how they'd react. Would they think I was overreacting? Would they tell me to forgive Victoria because she's family? Aunt Helen must have heard the worry in my silence because she quickly added that everyone was on my side and angry at Victoria for how she'd treated me. The dinner was at Aunt Helen's house with my uncle and 2 cousins I hadn't seen in months. I walked in nervous, expecting awkward conversations or pressure to reconcile, but instead my uncle hugged me tight and told me he was proud of me for leaving. My cousins both said they'd heard what Victoria did and couldn't believe she'd been so cruel. The support felt overwhelming in the best way, like I'd been bracing for criticism and got validation instead. During dinner, my cousin Sarah shared a story about Victoria showing up at her college graduation party years ago and spending the whole time complaining about the food and decorations. Sarah had planned everything herself, and Victoria made her feel stupid for trying. My other cousin mentioned Victoria had been rude to his girlfriend at Thanksgiving, making comments about her weight that made everyone uncomfortable. My uncle talked about how Victoria borrowed money from him last year and never paid it back, then got angry when he asked about it. As everyone shared their experiences, I realized Victoria's cruelty wasn't unique to me. She'd been dismissive and mean to multiple family members. But I'd accepted it as normal because she was my sister, and I thought that meant I had to tolerate anything. Everyone else had pulled back from her, set boundaries, stopped expecting her to be kind. I was the only one still trying to have a close relationship with someone who'd shown me repeatedly she didn't want one. After we finished eating, Sarah pulled me aside and told me Victoria had called her 3 days ago asking for money. Victoria claimed I'd abandoned her and she couldn't afford rent now, making it sound like I'd left without warning or reason. Sarah said she told Victoria no and suggested she get a second job, like I'd done when I was helping support both of us. Victoria had gotten angry and hung up, which didn't surprise me at all. The fact that she was calling relatives asking for money while driving a BMW made my blood boil all over again. She hadn't learned anything from losing me, hadn't reflected on her behavior, or tried to change. She just wanted to find someone else to use, another person who would give her money and emotional support without expecting anything in return. I felt grateful my family could see through her manipulation, that they weren't falling for her victim act the way I had for so long. 3 weeks after moving out, I woke up without that tight feeling in my chest for the first time in months. The nightmares about Victoria laughing at me while I tried to explain myself had stopped happening every night. Now, they only came once or twice a week, and I could actually fall back asleep afterward instead of lying awake until morning. Lyanna and I started cooking dinner together on weekends. Nothing fancy, just pasta or stir-fry. But it felt good to share a kitchen with someone who didn't criticize how I chopped vegetables or tell me I was doing everything wrong. She invited me to meet her friends at a bar one Thursday night, and I almost said no because meeting new people scared me after everything with Victoria. But I went, and her friends were actually nice. They asked me questions about my life and seemed interested in the answers. Nobody kept score of who paid for drinks or who talked more. When I mentioned I'd just moved, nobody demanded to know why or pushed for details I wasn't ready to share. One of her friends, a guy named Andrew, told a funny story about his own sister drama, and everyone laughed with him instead of at him. Walking home that night, I realized I'd gone 3 whole hours without thinking about Victoria once. The next morning, I opened my email and saw a message from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line said, "Please read this." And when I opened it, I saw Victoria's name at the bottom. She must have created a new account after I blocked her main one. The email was long, at least 10 paragraphs, and I started reading, even though I knew I shouldn't. It began with an apology that sounded real for about 2 sentences. Then she wrote that I was tearing the family apart by refusing to talk to her. She said she'd been drunk at the party and didn't mean what she said. The next paragraph blamed me for being too sensitive and not understanding that friends vent to each other. She wrote that I was making everything worse by telling family members lies about her. I stopped reading halfway through and moved the cursor to the delete button. My hand shook a little, but I clicked it anyway. The email disappeared, and I closed my laptop. I didn't need to read the rest to know it wouldn't get better. At my therapy session with Isadora that week, I told her about the email. She asked me what I noticed about Victoria's apology, and I said it felt wrong, but I couldn't explain why. Isadora pulled out a notepad and drew a line down the middle. On one side, she wrote real apology, and on the other side, she wrote fake apology. She explained that real apologies acknowledge the harm someone caused without making excuses. They don't include the word but or shift blame to the person who got hurt. Fake apologies come with justifications like, "I was drunk," or accusations like, "You're too sensitive." Victoria's email had both. Isadora asked me to count how many times Victoria took responsibility versus how many times she blamed me or made excuses. I realized the whole email was fake apologies stacked on top of each other. Understanding this framework made the guilt I'd been carrying start to lift. I wasn't being mean by not responding. I was protecting myself from someone who wasn't actually sorry. When I checked my bank account that week, I noticed something strange. I had more money than I expected. Without Victoria's half of the rent coming out every month, I actually had money left over after paying my bills. I'd been living on such a tight budget for so long that I forgot what having extra money felt like. I logged into my credit card account and saw I owed $800, mostly from emergencies over the past year when Victoria needed something, and I put on my card. I paid off the whole balance right there. Then I opened a savings account and transferred $200 into it. I sat staring at the screen for a minute because I'd never had a savings account before. Every extra dollar had always gone to Victoria or to covering expenses she said she couldn't afford. Now I was actually saving money for myself, building something instead of just staying afloat. Sunday afternoon, Aunt Helen called and asked if I wanted to come over for tea. When I got to her house, she sat me down at her kitchen table with a serious look on her face. She told me Victoria had moved back in with her and Brad temporarily because she couldn't afford the apartment on her own. Brad's parents were apparently upset about it because they didn't think Victoria should be living with their son before getting engaged. The situation was causing fights between Brad and his family. Helen said Victoria was stressed and not handling it well, snapping at Brad and complaining constantly. Part of me felt satisfied hearing this. Victoria was finally facing real consequences for taking me for granted. But mostly, I just felt sad and tired. I'd lost someone I thought was my closest family member, and hearing that she was struggling didn't make me feel better. It just reminded me that the relationship I thought we had never actually existed. In my next therapy session, I told Isadora about feeling guilty for being glad Victoria was facing consequences. Isadora leaned forward and said something that stuck with me. She said, "You didn't lose a real relationship with Victoria. You lost an illusion of a relationship. The sister you thought you had, the one who valued you and cared about you, was never real. Victoria showed you who she actually was at that party." Grieving the loss of what I thought we had was valid, but it was different from grieving the loss of a real, mutual relationship. The grief I felt was for the sister I imagined, not the sister who actually existed. This helped me understand why I felt so confused. I was mourning something that never existed in the first place. A month after the party, I got a message on social media from Chloe. I almost deleted it without reading, but curiosity won. She wrote that she was sorry for laughing at me and encouraging Victoria to be cruel. She said watching Victoria spiral after I left made her realize how toxic their whole friend group was. Chloe explained that she'd pulled back from Victoria and was trying to be a better person. The message ended with her asking if we could talk sometime. I read it twice, then closed the app without responding. Maybe Chloe really was sorry. Maybe she really did learn something. But I didn't know her forgiveness or my time. She participated in humiliating me in front of a room full of people. Her growth journey wasn't my responsibility. At work on Wednesday, my boss called me into her office, and I felt my stomach drop. Getting called to the boss's office never meant anything good. But when I sat down, she smiled and told me I was getting promoted to senior associate. She said my performance over the past month had been outstanding, that I'd shown initiative and focus that impressed the whole team. The promotion came with a raise and better benefits. I thanked her and tried to act professional, but inside, I was screaming with excitement. Without Victoria's drama eating up all my mental energy, without the nightly phone calls and constant crisis management, I actually had space to focus on my career. I was advancing and building something for myself instead of treading water, while supporting someone who didn't appreciate it. That weekend, Lina and I were watching TV when she muted a commercial and turned to me. She said she'd been thinking about getting a cat and wondered if I'd want to adopt one together. The idea surprised me at first. I'd never had a pet, and sharing responsibility for something felt scary after everything with Victoria. But then I realized this was different. Lina was asking me to build something positive with her, to make this apartment feel like home, instead of just a place I escaped to. She wasn't asking me to take care of her cat. She was asking us to take care of our cat together. I said yes before I could overthink it. We went to the shelter on Sunday morning and walked through rows of cats in cages. Most of them ignored us or hissed, but one orange tabby pushed his face against the bars and meowed at us. The shelter worker said his name was Marmalade, and he'd been there for 3 months because people wanted kittens instead of adult cats. Lina opened the cage, and the cat immediately rubbed against her hand, purring so loud we could hear it across the room. She looked at me, and I nodded. We filled out the adoption papers, and the worker helped us load the cat carrier into Lina's car. On the drive home, Lina said we should rename him something that matched his color. I suggested Toast, and she laughed, saying it was perfect. Back at the apartment, we set up his litter box and food bowls together. Toast explored every corner of the space, sniffing everything and marking territory. Watching Lina and me work together to make him comfortable, sharing this responsibility in a healthy way where we both contributed equally, showed me what balanced relationships actually looked like. Nobody was keeping score. Nobody was taking advantage. We were just two people taking care of something together because we both wanted to. The next day at work, I sat at my desk eating the salad I'd packed when the receptionist called my extension. She said someone was here to see me. But before I could ask who, I heard Victoria's voice in the background getting louder. I grabbed my phone and walked to the lobby where Victoria stood near the front desk with tears running down her face. She saw me and started walking fast in my direction, saying we needed to talk right now. I told the receptionist to call security and stepped back toward the hallway. Victoria followed me, saying I was being dramatic and we were sisters and she just needed 5 minutes. Security arrived within seconds. Two guys I recognized from seeing them in the building. I told them I didn't want contact with this person and asked them to escort her out. Victoria started crying harder and reaching for my arm, but one of the security guards gently blocked her path. She kept saying my name over and over while they walked her toward the exit. My coworkers were staring from their desks, and I felt my face get hot. I went back to my office and closed the door, sitting down in my chair with my hands shaking so hard I had to put them flat on the desk to make them stop. The shaking lasted almost an hour, coming in waves every time I replayed Victoria crying in the lobby. But underneath the shaking was something else. Something that felt almost like pride. I'd held the boundary. Even when she cried. Even when she made a scene. Even when part of me wanted to just talk to her to make it stop. Around 3 that afternoon, my boss knocked on my door and asked if I had a minute. I followed her to her office, expecting some kind of lecture about personal drama at work. Instead, she closed the door and asked if I was okay. I explained briefly that it was a family situation I was handling and apologized for the disruption. She waved off the apology and said she'd already talked to security about updating their system with Victoria's photo, so she couldn't get into the building again. The institutional support, having my workplace actively protect me from Victoria, felt validating in a way I hadn't expected. My boss asked if I needed to take the rest of the day off, but I said I'd rather stay busy. She nodded and told me her door was open if I needed anything else. That week in therapy, Isadora and I started working on something new. She asked me to talk about my parents' death separately from Victoria's betrayal, to process those as two different traumas instead of one combined thing. I realized as I talked that I'd never properly grieved my parents because I was too busy trying to keep Victoria afloat. When Mom and Dad died, Victoria fell apart immediately, and I stepped into the role of holding everything together. I planned the funeral, handled the estate paperwork, made sure Victoria ate and showered, and got to work. I thought I was being strong, being the good sister, but really I was just delaying my own grief. That delayed grief was hitting me now alongside everything else. 3 years of sadness I'd pushed down, coming up all at once. Isadora helped me see that Victoria had weaponized our parents' memory, used their death as a way to keep me tied to her. The trauma bond Victoria dismissed as fake was actually real for me, just not mutual. On Saturday morning, I drove to the cemetery for the first time in a year. I'd avoided going because Victoria always wanted to go together and make it this big emotional thing. I parked near the entrance and walked through rows of headstones until I found theirs, side by side under an oak tree. I sat down on the grass and started talking out loud, telling them about the party and what Victoria had said. I apologized for letting Victoria use their memory as a weapon, for not protecting what they'd wanted for us. The crying that came felt different from crying at home. Cleaner, somehow, like it was washing something out instead of just expressing pain. I stayed there for almost 2 hours, talking and crying, and sitting in silence. When I left, I felt lighter, but also sad in a new way, grieving them properly instead of through the filter of taking care of Victoria. The next week, Aunt Helen called and asked me to come over for dinner. I drove to her house after work and found her making lasagna, my mom's recipe. We sat at the kitchen table while the food cooked, and she mentioned almost casually that Victoria and Brad had broken up. His family didn't approve of Victoria moving in without contributing financially to the household. Brad had apparently expected her to split expenses like normal couples do, but Victoria expected him to support her the way I had. When he refused and his parents got involved, the relationship fell apart. Aunt Helen said Victoria was devastated and back to living with her temporarily. I felt a complicated mix of feelings hearing this. Part of me felt satisfied, vindicated, watching Victoria face consequences for expecting everyone to carry her. But part of me felt sad because she was my sister and she was hurting, even if the hurt came from her own choices. Untangling those feelings, separating the vindication from the sadness from the guilt, was hard work that I'd need to keep doing in therapy. In my next session with Isadora, I talked about the breakup and my mixed reactions. She helped me understand that I could acknowledge Victoria was facing consequences, while also recognizing that those consequences came from Victoria's own behavior patterns. I wasn't responsible for fixing Victoria's problems or managing her emotions about the natural results of treating people badly. The guilt I felt was a trained response from years of being Victoria's emotional support system, not a reflection of actual wrongdoing on my part. Isadora asked me what I wanted my relationship with Victoria to look like in the future, if anything. I said I didn't know yet, that I needed more time to figure out who I was without her constant needs taking up space in my head. 2 months after the party, I woke up on a Wednesday and got ready for work, following my normal routine. I made coffee, fed toast, checked my emails, drove to the office. It wasn't until lunchtime that I realized I hadn't thought about Victoria once all morning. Actually, I hadn't thought about her in 3 days. Not since briefly mentioning the breakup to Lyanna. The obsessive mental loops where I replayed conversations and analyzed her behavior were fading. I was building a life that didn't revolve around Victoria's needs and drama. My brain had space for other things now. Work projects and weekend plans and conversations with friends that didn't circle back to my sister. The change felt significant enough that I texted Isadora about it, and she responded saying this was real progress. That weekend, Lyanna and I hosted a small dinner party with 3 of her friends from college. I helped cook and set the table, feeling nervous about meeting new people. But the evening went smoothly. Everyone laughing and telling stories and asking me questions about my life. They asked because they actually cared about the answers, not because they needed something from me or were gathering information to use later. One of Lyanna's friends worked in graphic design, and we talked for almost an hour about her projects. Another friend had just adopted a dog and wanted advice about introducing pets to new spaces since we had toast. I laughed genuinely for the first time in months. A real laugh that came from enjoying the moment instead of forcing happiness. These people were building connections with me as an equal, not as someone who existed to serve their needs. On Tuesday, I came home from work to find a letter in the mailbox addressed to me in Victoria's handwriting. Aunt Helen had warned me it was coming. Had asked if I wanted her to screen my mail, but I'd said no. The envelope was thick, multiple pages inside. I sat on the couch with toast curled next to me and opened it carefully. 6 pages of Victoria's handwriting, front and back. The letter started with an apology that actually sounded real. No excuses or justifications mixed in. She said she'd started seeing a therapist after the breakup with Brad, that her therapist was helping her understand how she treated people. She took responsibility for using me financially and emotionally. For saying cruel things at the party. For taking me for granted for years. She didn't ask me to forgive her or contact her. She just said she was sorry, and she understood if I never wanted to speak to her again. I read it twice, looking for the catch, the hidden blame or manipulation. But it seemed genuine. Just Victoria acknowledging what she'd done wrong without trying to make it my problem to fix. I folded it back into the envelope and set it on the coffee table, not sure what to do with it yet. In my Thursday session, I brought the letter and read parts of it to Isadora. We discussed what responding might look like if I even wanted to respond. Isadora asked what I wanted from Victoria, what I needed to feel okay about potential future contact. I said I wasn't ready yet, that the letter could sit while I figured out what I wanted instead of what Victoria needed from me. For the first time, I was putting my own needs first in relation to my sister. The letter proved Victoria was working on herself, but that didn't mean I had to immediately welcome her back into my life.
I could take my time.
Could wait until I felt genuinely ready instead of guilt into reconnecting. Isadora nodded and said that was healthy. That I was protecting my own healing instead of prioritizing Victoria's feelings. The letter could wait as long as I needed it to wait. The invitation to my uncle's birthday party arrived 2 weeks after Victoria's letter. And I noticed immediately that Victoria's name wasn't on it. Just mine, addressed specifically to me at Lyanna's apartment, which meant Aunt Helen had made sure the family knew my new address. I called my uncle to confirm I was coming, and he sounded genuinely happy to hear from me. He asked how I was doing, how the new place was working out, and never once mentioned Victoria. The absence of her name in the conversation felt deliberate, careful, like everyone had agreed not to bring her up unless I did first. On Saturday afternoon, I drove to my uncle's house with a gift I'd picked out myself, not worrying about whether Victoria would judge my choice or make fun of the wrapping. Walking up to the front door, I felt nervous in a way I hadn't expected, like I was being tested somehow. But when my aunt opened the door and pulled me into a hug, holding on longer than usual, the tension started to ease. Inside, my cousins greeted me warmly, and I noticed how they positioned themselves near me, creating a buffer zone of support. The party was small, just close family, and everyone seemed hyper-aware of making me comfortable. My uncle thanked me for the gift, then asked about my job, and actually listened to my answer instead of waiting to talk about himself. We ate lunch on the back patio, and I sat between my younger cousin and Aunt Helen, who kept checking on me with little glances. Nobody mentioned Victoria directly, but her absence hung over everything like whether nobody wanted to acknowledge. I appreciated the support, the way everyone was trying to show me I mattered, but it also made me sad. Our family dynamic had shifted permanently, split into before and after the birthday party incident, and we were all learning how to navigate this new version. After lunch, my cousin Hazel pulled me aside near the garden, away from the others. She looked uncomfortable but determined, twisting her bracelet around her wrist. She told me Victoria had been calling her, asking about me, wanting to know if I was okay and what I was up to. Hazel said Victoria sounded genuinely worried, not manipulative or fake, just concerned. I felt a complicated mix of emotions hearing this because part of me wanted to know Victoria cared, but another part of me recognized this was exactly why I needed distance. Hazel said Victoria had asked her to tell me she was respecting my boundaries, that she wasn't going to contact me directly, but she wanted me to know she was thinking about me. I thanked Hazel for telling me and asked her not to share details about my life with Victoria. Hazel nodded and squeezed my hand, understanding without me having to explain further. The fact that Victoria was asking about me through family instead of showing up at my apartment or workplace meant something. She was actually listening to what I needed, giving me space, even though it was clearly hard for her. That restraint felt more meaningful than her 6-page apology letter because it showed she was trying to change her behavior, not just her words. I went back to the party feeling lighter somehow, like knowing Victoria was struggling with our separation, but respecting it anyway made the boundary feel less cruel. 3 months after the party, I sat down at my desk with paper and a pen, toast curled up on the chair next to me. I'd been thinking about Victoria's letter for weeks, reading it multiple times, analyzing every sentence for hidden meanings or manipulations I never found. Writing back felt necessary, not for Victoria, but for myself, to mark this moment in my healing process. I started the letter explaining this wasn't forgiveness, just acknowledgement. I wrote that I received her apology and appreciated her taking full responsibility, without excuses. I told her I needed more time and space, maybe a lot more time, but I recognized she was working on herself, and that mattered. The letter took me 2 hours to write because I kept stopping to make sure I wasn't being too harsh or too soft, wasn't giving her false hope or unnecessary cruelty. I explained my boundaries clearly, what I needed from her if we ever had contact again, what I wouldn't accept anymore. I didn't promise anything or suggest a timeline for reconnection. I just acknowledged where we were and where I was in my own journey. When I finished, I read it through twice, then sealed it in an envelope before I could second-guess myself. Walking to the mailbox felt significant, like I was closing one chapter of my life and accepting that the next chapter might not include Victoria the way the previous ones had. Dropping the letter in the slot, I felt relief mixed with sadness. But mostly I felt clear. I'd said what I needed to say without anger or bitterness. And now it was done. My company sent me to a marketing conference in Chicago 2 weeks later. My first work trip since everything happened. The change of scenery felt good, being in a different city where nobody knew about my sister drama or family complications. I focused on the conference sessions, taking notes, and networking with other professionals in my field. My boss had specifically chosen me for this trip because of my recent excellent performance, which felt validating in a way that had nothing to do with Victoria. During breaks, I explored the city, ate at restaurants I picked myself, and enjoyed the freedom of making decisions based only on what I wanted. The conference covered new marketing strategies and digital trends, and I found myself genuinely engaged, asking questions and contributing ideas. One evening, I had dinner with colleagues from other companies, and we talked about career goals and industry changes. I realized I was building something for myself, a professional identity and network that existed completely separate from my role as Victoria's sister or caretaker. Being away from everything helped me see my life with fresh perspective. I had healthy friendships with Lina and her circle. I was advancing in my career. I was processing my grief properly with Isidora's help. I was actually okay, maybe better than okay. And that realization hit me hard in a hotel room overlooking the Chicago skyline. I'd spent so long defining myself in relation to Victoria, managing her needs and emotions, that I'd forgotten I could just exist for myself. On the last day of the conference, I sat at lunch with a woman named Rachel from a firm in Boston. She asked about my family in that casual way people do when making conversation, and I gave a brief, honest answer without falling apart. I told her my sister and I weren't close right now, keeping my tone neutral and matter-of-fact. Rachel nodded and moved on to other topics without pressing for details or offering unwanted advice. The simplicity of that statement, without drama or lengthy explanation, felt powerful. I didn't know strangers my trauma or my story. I could acknowledge the situation existed without making it the center of every interaction. Later, waiting for my flight home, I thought about how far I'd come in 3 months. I'd gone from sobbing in Aunt Helen's guest room to calmly discussing my family situation with a stranger without my voice shaking. The growth felt tangible, measurable, real. I wasn't pretending to be okay or forcing positivity. I was genuinely building a life that worked for me, one where Victoria's absence left space for me to discover who I was without her. When I got back to the apartment, Toast ran to greet me at the door, meowing and rubbing against my legs. Lina had left my favorite snacks on the kitchen counter with a welcome home note that made me smile. I unpacked my suitcase and looked around at the space we created together, the throw pillows we'd picked out, the photos on the walls, the plants Lina was teaching me to keep alive. This apartment felt like home now, not just a refuge I'd escaped to. I wasn't living here because I had nowhere else to go. I was living here because I wanted to, because I was building a life I actually liked instead of one built around managing Victoria's needs and moods. Lina came home from work an hour later, and we made dinner together while I told her about the conference. She asked good questions and seemed genuinely interested in my professional growth, celebrating my successes without making them about her. That evening, sitting on the couch with Toast between us watching a movie, I felt content in a way I hadn't felt in years. This was what healthy relationships looked like, what reciprocal care and support felt like. I wasn't constantly worried about saying the wrong thing or being judged for my choices. I could just exist. Aunt Helen called the next week and invited me to lunch at her favorite cafe downtown. We met on Saturday afternoon, and she hugged me tight before we went inside. Over sandwiches and coffee, she asked how I was doing, and I told her honestly about my progress. She listened carefully, nodding and asking follow-up questions that showed she understood the complexity of my situation. Then she brought up Victoria, gently and carefully, watching my face for signs I wanted her to stop. She said Victoria was doing better, working 2 jobs now, seeing her therapist regularly, taking real responsibility for her life. Aunt Helen said she wasn't pushing me to reconnect or suggesting I owed Victoria anything. She was just planting a seed, asking if I'd be willing to see Victoria at some point in the future.
Not soon, but eventually.
I sat with the question for a moment, stirring my coffee and thinking about what I actually wanted. I told Aunt Helen, maybe someday, but I'm not ready. And I might never be ready, and I need you to be okay with that uncertainty. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand, telling me she supported whatever I decided and wouldn't pressure me either way. The conversation felt important because it acknowledged that reconciliation was possible without demanding it happen on anyone's timeline but mine. That night, lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, I realized I hadn't checked Victoria's social media in weeks. I used to look at her posts multiple times a day, tracking her life and activities, wondering what she was doing and if she was thinking about me. Now, I couldn't remember the last time I'd searched for her profile or looked at her updates. The mental energy I'd spent on her for years, worrying about her feelings and monitoring her moods, was now going toward my own goals and happiness. I was reading books I wanted to read, taking an online photography class, planning a weekend trip with Liana to visit her family. My thoughts weren't consumed by Victoria anymore. She existed somewhere in my life, in my past, and maybe in my future. But she wasn't the center of my present. That shift felt monumental, like I'd finally stepped out of her shadow and into my own light. In my Thursday session with Isadora, we discussed what healthy boundaries with Victoria might look like if I ever chose to have contact again. Isadora helped me map out what limited, structured interaction could look like with clear consequences if Victoria reverted to old patterns. We talked about meeting in public places, keeping conversations focused on specific topics, having an exit strategy if things went wrong. Isadora emphasized that I got to set the terms of any future relationship, that I didn't owe Victoria the closeness we used to have just because we were sisters. Having this framework made the possibility of future contact feel less scary, more manageable. I could imagine seeing Victoria again without immediately returning to our old dynamic where I absorbed all her problems and emotions. The boundaries we discussed weren't mean or punitive. They were protective, designed to keep me safe while allowing for the possibility that Victoria had genuinely changed. Isadora reminded me I could always change my mind, that choosing to see Victoria once didn't mean committing to ongoing contact. I had control over this process, and that control felt empowering. The lease renewal papers arrived in the mail, and Lina and I sat at the kitchen table reviewing them together. She asked if I wanted to stay another year, making it clear she hoped I would, but wouldn't pressure me either way. I looked at the apartment around us, thought about the life I'd built here, and realized I wanted to stay. Signing that paperwork felt significant, like I was committing to this new life I'd created rather than leaving options open to return to my old one. I wasn't keeping one foot out the door anymore, waiting to see if things with Victoria would improve enough for me to move back. I was choosing this space, this roommate, this version of my life where I came first. Lina signed her section, then I signed mine, and we celebrated with ice cream and a movie. Later that night, I thought about how much had changed in 3 months. I'd gone from standing in Victoria's apartment holding a ruined cake to signing a lease on a home where I felt valued and safe. The distance between those two moments felt enormous, like I'd traveled years instead of months. I still had work to do in therapy, still had complicated feelings about Victoria and our family, but I was genuinely happy with where I was. That happiness didn't depend on Victoria changing or apologizing or wanting me back in her life. It existed independently, built on my own choices and relationships and growth, and that made it real. I scheduled the tattoo appointment for a Tuesday afternoon when I knew I'd have time to sit with the decision without rushing back to work. The shop was small and clean, tucked between a coffee place and a bookstore, and the artist walked me through the design I'd brought in. A phoenix rising, small enough to fit on my inner wrist. The kind of thing I could look at whenever I needed to remember I'd survived something hard. Victoria had always said tattoos were trashy, that they made women look cheap, and I'd listened to her, even though I'd wanted one since college. The needle hurt more than I expected, but in a good way. Like the pain was marking something real. I watched things take shape on my skin and thought about how I was making this choice completely on my own. No one's opinion mattered except mine. When it was done and wrapped, I paid with money I'd saved from not covering Victoria's expenses anymore. And walking out of that shop felt like crossing some invisible line into a version of myself I actually liked. Thanksgiving arrived faster than I expected, and Aunt Helen called to confirm I was coming to her place for dinner. She mentioned Victoria would be there too. Said it gently, like she was giving me the option to back out, but I told her I'd come anyway. I wasn't ready to rebuild anything with Victoria, but I also wasn't so fragile that being in the same room would destroy me. Lina offered to come with me for support, but I told her this was something I needed to do alone. I drove to Aunt Helen's house with Toast's carrier in the back seat because I was dropping him at a friend's place first. And the whole drive, I practiced staying calm in my head. When I walked in, Victoria was already there, sitting at the far end of the living room with a plate of appetizers. We made eye contact and both nodded. This weird, formal acknowledgement that we existed in the same space, but weren't going to pretend everything was fine. Aunt Helen seated us at opposite ends of the table during dinner, which felt deliberate, but necessary. I talked with my uncle and cousins, passed dishes, laughed at jokes, and the whole time I was aware of Victoria across from me, but not consumed by it. She looked thinner, tired, and I felt a small pang of concern that I didn't let grow into anything bigger. This was what distant looked like. Being polite without being connected. And it was uncomfortable, but not devastating like I'd feared. After dinner, Victoria and I ended up in the kitchen at the same time, both reaching for coffee. She poured hers, then asked if I wanted some. This tiny gesture that felt massive given everything. I said yes, and we stood there for a minute, neither of us sure what came next. She told me she was working 2 jobs now, one at a retail store and another doing administrative work on weekends, and that she'd found a studio apartment she could actually afford on her own. Her voice was matter-of-fact, not asking for praise or sympathy, just stating what was happening in her life. I told her I was glad she was doing better, managing on her own, and I meant it, without wanting to get pulled back into taking care of her. She nodded and said she was sorry again, quieter this time. And I accepted it, without offering forgiveness or promises about the future. We weren't close and probably never would be again, but we also weren't enemies standing in a kitchen pretending the other didn't exist. It was something in between. This weird neutral zone where we were just 2 people who shared DNA and some painful history. Driving home with Aunt Helen later, I stared out the window at the dark streets and felt this unexpected lightness in my chest. I didn't need Victoria's friendship to be okay anymore. Didn't need her to validate my worth or make me feel like I mattered. I had Lionel and Toast and Aunt Helen and my job, and this whole life I'd built that existed completely separate from my sister. Our relationship would never be what I thought it was when I was standing in her apartment holding that ruined cake. But I'd built something better from those broken pieces. I was genuinely happy with my life now. Not in spite of losing Victoria, but because losing her forced me to find myself. That was enough. More than enough. And I didn't need anything else. Seriously, what would you have done in my shoes? Have you ever had to draw a line with family like this? Tell me your story in the comments below. I'd really love to hear from you.